Good afternoon. I'm Dave Lehman, and I'm going to try to present something a little bit more on how we can share our faith with others, especially to skeptics and atheists. Now, there's only two possible worldviews, either a theistic explanation for things or a non theistic. Either God did it or he didn't. Either it happened naturally or supernaturally. So, if you show that it couldn't happen naturally, then it must have happened supernaturally. So, so what we're going to do is try to show that it couldn't happen naturally. And I'd like to look at all the originators of the evolutionary theory because evolution is the only alternative to creation, at least the only one they've come up with so far. Either either God did it or he didn't. And if it couldn't happen naturally, then it had to be a supernatural process. Now it doesn't say who God is, but it says that it has to be an intelligent designer. And so I'd like to look at that first of all. The originators of the evolutionary theory, a person like Jean Lamarck. Now, Jean Lamarck was he started what they called Lamarckianism. He said the giraffe got its long neck by stretching up trying to get leaves. That's ridiculous. That the duck got its webbed feet by kind of wandering around in the water. Well, that doesn't happen, and we don't see that happening. But that was his theory. The second guy is James Hutton. Now, James Hutton actually started a little bit before Jean Lamarck, and James Hutton was the founder of modern geology. Well, modern geology is basically based on the fact that Hutton said that the things that are happening today are happening the same way they happen throughout time. In other words, the rate at which things happen and the methods that things happen have not changed. It's called uniformitarianism. So uh, his theory, and he did all of this before he ever went out and looked at a rock. So he was the founder of modern geology, basically by the idea that it had to happen naturally. And so it happened naturally. Well, then it must have taken a long time for all this to happen. So now we've got billions of years in which we're supposed to see this evolution take place, because if it's not happening in today, then it must have happened in the past, but we're not seeing it happen. So it must have been a very slow process. And this is the basis of uniformitarianism, which Charles Lyell, who actually was born the year that Hutton died, Charles Lyell wrote a book. And that book basically was called The Principles of Geology. That was in 1830. And it was based on Hutton. Stressed that there are natural as opposed to supernatural explanations for all geologic phenomena. Well, that gets rid of a creation, and it also gets rid of a worldwide flood. So it's basically he, along with Alfred Russel Wallace. Now Wallace was on the island of Ternate and in the Moluccas. He was having a delirious fever when all of a sudden he conceived the idea of survival of the fittest. The problem with survival of the fittest is it doesn't say anything. It's a tautology. Of course the fittest are going to survive. Who else is going to survive? So they had to come up with something else. And so they went from Darwinianism, which was survival of the fittest, to neo-Darwinianism, which is mutation plus natural selection. Mutation is the only way to change anything. Otherwise, it's going to be the same. So you have to have some mechanism that would cause things to happen. So mutation is like shooting a bullet at a chromosome and destroying some of the genes. It's not adding new teleonomy or specific information to the genetic code. It's simply jumbling up or destroying some of the information that's there. And as specificity increases, the role played by spontaneity decreases. The more complex the system is, the less likely a random process is going to increase that complexity. So then we have Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin basically stole Wallace's idea. Wallace actually wrote him, and he took that idea of survival of the fittest, and he wrote his book based on that idea. Species must have been changed from other parts of the world somehow through the environment. And then so there was all these transitional forms, and then they flew, they swim, or they walked over here to this part of the world. And that's why we see them, but we didn't see the changes back there that happened before. That was his idea. And he said basically what was happening is a mechanism he called pangenesis. So the environment put stresses on this particular animal, and they floated down somehow into the genes. And basically were transferred to the next species. Well, that was Darwin's explanation. And of course, if you read his book, it's maybe this happened or possibly this happened. Actually, he didn't know anything happened this way, but that's how it reads. Isn't science wonderful? Maybe this or possibly that. Well, Thomas Huxley, he was Darwin's bulldog. Darwin was rather sickly, and Huxley took his stuff, and he basically founded the X Club. He was the head of he chaired the X Club, and that reviewed all the scientific papers that were being considered by the Royal Society, and they had to be approved by these guys who were all evolutionists, and therefore nothing that was creationist was allowed to get through. It's kind of like what's happening today. Then you have Ernest Haeckel. Ernest Haeckel, in 1834 to 1919, he drew these fraudulent charts showing how the human embryo goes through all the different stages of evolution in the womb. Well, with the advent of photoscopy, where basically it's ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's the idea that the so-called embryo goes through all the various stages of evolution and finally comes out to be a human. But with the advent of the photoscopy, or basically a way of photographing this development of that embryo, we see that that's not true at all. And everybody knew that wasn't true even back in Haeckel's day. But whenever they're trying to give some kind of justification for abortion, that's what they use. They say, well, it's not a person yet. What they mean is it's some other animal. We're not killing a human being. We're killing some pre-human type thing, creature, whatever it is. That's, even though they know better, that's the excuse that they use. And then Robert Mueller was actually, he was retired United Nations Assistant Secretary General, and he said, I believe the most important fundamental thing that we can do is to believe in evolution. In other words, evolution is central to New Age belief. Well, of course, it's central to New Age belief, but New Age is not Christian. New Age is basically a form of mysticism. Evolution is inseparable from New Age conceptions of God, creation, history, Christ, salvation, sanctification, eschatology. Evolution is God in process to the New Ager. And Theodosius Dobzhansky, he said, evolution comprises all the stages of the development of the universe. The cosmic, biological, human, or cultural developments. Attempts to restrict the concept of evolution to biology are gratuitous. Life is the product of evolution of inorganic nature, and man is the product of evolution of life. And Fritjof Capra, a famous New Ager, he said, evolution is the basic assumption in which all New Age thinking is made. He says, Capra says, all structures, from subatomic particles to galaxies, from bacteria to human beings, are manifestations of the universe's self-organizing dynamic. In other words, the cosmic mind. Stephen Jay Gould, who is probably the leading authority on evolution, he was a professor of biology at Harvard, he said sudden appearance basically is what happens. Sudden appearance means that all of a sudden it jumped from one kind to another kind without leaving any transitional forms. So the reason you don't see evolution happen in the present world is because evolution goes too slow. We need billions of years to see that happen. The reason we don't see it in the fossil record is because evolution goes too fast. It goes in spurts. Anyway, we don't see evolution either in the present or the past, and science is supposed to be what we can see and observe. And then we have people like Davis Young. Davis Young basically started off as a young Earth creationist, but he was attending classes that teach uniformitarianism geology. And in 1990, he attended a symposium at Wheaton College, and which convinced him that you couldn't tinker with the Bible and somehow make this work. So he said the Bible Bible expresses history in non-factual terms, whatever that means. Then we've got Charles Templeton. For more than 20 years, Charles Templeton was a major figure in the church in Canada. Basically, he was head of the Canadian Youth for Christ. And actually, during the 1950s, he and Billy Graham were the two most successful opponents of mass evangelism in America. Templeton spoke to the crowds, stadium crowds of over 30,000 people. However, increasing doubts about the validity of the Old Testament he got from the idea of progressive creationism, and he learned that when he went to Princeton Seminary. Princeton Seminary had dropped this idea of young Earth creation, and now they're starting to teach an old Earth creation, and if you teach that, you can't hold to the Old Testament. So you lose the inerrancy of Scripture out of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But Jesus talked about Adam and Eve, about Cain and Abel, about Noah, the flood, in detail, and he said, if it were not so, I would have told you. So the words of Christ come in question as well. So Templeton lost his faith in seminary. You're not supposed to lose your faith in cemetery. In cemetery, that's what some people call it. So anyway, that several of the theologians lost their faith in basically the seminary itself. It's because of the liberalism that was permeating in the 1920s, and actually they started a new seminary called Westminster Theological Seminary. That was J. Gresham Machen, who was actually my favorite Greek scholar, and he, along with several others, went and founded Westminster Seminary based upon the problems that they were having at Princeton. And people like O.T. Alice, Robert Dick Wilson, Cornelius Van Til, many of them were outstanding scholars. But anyway, they began they began Westminster, and then you have Bruce Waltke. Waltke was one of the great Hebrew scholars. He graduated from Harvard. Then he was a professor at the Dallas Theological Seminary, one of the greatest seminaries in the country. But he was having problems with certain things, and he actually said that he became a framework advocate. In other words, we cannot summarily discount evidence of earth sciences. So therefore, he believed that somehow the earth sciences were true, even though they went greatly against what the scriptures teach. Well, Bruce Waltke actually wasn't, because of his beliefs, he was actually not allowed to teach at other places. He left Dallas, and he wasn't teaching at Trinity. So he had some serious problems there, even though he's a great Hebrew scholar. And as John Walvoord, the president of Dallas Seminary, said, you can be a great Hebrew scholar and a lousy theologian. And you can be a great theologian and a lousy Hebrew scholar. It works both ways. But anyway, the biology textbook by Neil Campbell, it was used at Purdue as when I was there, said evolution is the core theme of biology. Evolution is the theme of all themes, the thread that ties together all other unifying features of biology. As an overarching theme of biology, evolution is built into every chapter, with some chapters exclusively based on it. Evolution has become the total philosophy which tries to explain the origin and development of all things by natural processes in a closed universe apart from any divine intervention. This evolutionary thinking has become the pseudoscientific rationale for almost all evil doctrines and influences in the world. If there's no personal God, then nobody is responsible to him, so they can do whatever they want. Now, my second slide, when it deals with treason of educators, we've got people like John Dewey. John Dewey was a Marxist, and his plan was to dumb down America so they would be able to accept socialism. In 1898, he outlined in an essay entitled The Primary Education Fetish. In it, he showed his fellow progressives how to transform America into a collectivist utopia by taking over the public schools and destroying the literacy of millions of Americans. The plan has been so successful, successfully implemented, that it is now a fact that half of Americans' adult population are functionally illiterate. They can't read the nation's Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Many of them can't read their own high school diplomas. The method of achieving this was simply by changing the way children are taught to read in public schools. The traditional reading was through phonics, but now he's got this look-say method, which was used in some cases with people that couldn't hear. They couldn't pronounce the words, so they were trying to look at a picture and then try to memorize the word that went along with that picture. It's kind of like trying to read Chinese, but they tried it in Boston. After about 6 months, they gave up on it, because you can only learn so many words that way. And so children become functionally illiterate. Basically, he had to figure out a way to persuade the teachers that this was the best way to teach students. And so he had Edmund Berkey Huey, who wrote a doctoral dissertation on education based on the material he got from G. Stanley Hall. And basically, he was able to convince them that maybe this look-say method was a good way to teach reading. And in fact, it was a wrong way to teach. It's actually a form of child abuse, because many children become dyslexic as a result of using the wrong part of the brain to try to learn how to read. And then we go to the Frankfurt School, which my next slide is talking about. The Frankfurt School was actually headed by a guy named Herbert Marcuse. He's the guy that came up with Make Love, Not War. But he was also in charge of going after the educational system, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and he would get money from the Rockefeller Foundation, which was Marxist in general, and he would take money from there and get people in administrative positions who would hire Marxist professors, who would hire in turn Marxist associate professors who would hire teaching assistants, and it would go right down through the system from postdoctoral work right through kindergarten, and it permeated the entire educational system of America. They call it the Long March through the institutions. Then we had other people doing the same thing. They bought the 25 leading newspapers, and they put their person as editor-in-chief, and he would hire people under him who were basically the same way, teaching the same Marxist mentality, and it would go right through radio, TV, the entire, every form of government employee, every system in the entire country. They call it the Long March through the institutions. Then, so what happened? The result of this is public schools today waste 12 years of your child's life. They cripple your child's ability to read. They deceive parents into thinking their children are doing well in school when they're not, because they change the grades. They give them a good grade, but it's really, they haven't learned anything. The public schools indoctrinate children with anti-parent, anti-American, anti-Judeo-Christian values. The public schools expose children to often shocking sexual material in the so-called sex education classes, and sometimes the parents are told that they have to give the children potentially dangerous mind-altering drugs. That's to calm them down. If the child is being a boy, like boys do, they move around and they're fidgety a little bit, so they give them some kind of drug which actually can destroy their ability to learn. This wasn't the way back in early America. The education of some of our founding fathers, John Trumbull, he was able to read the Bible when he was 4 years old, read through the entire Bible when he was 4. When he was 5.5, he beat his pastor in a Greek contest, and when he was 7.5 years old, he passed the entrance exam to Yale University. We find that Declaration signer Charles Carroll entered college at the age of 10. Fisher Ames entered Harvard when he was 12. Benjamin Rush graduated from Princeton when he was 14. John Quincy Adams, he received a congressional diplomatic appointment overseas as secretary to the ambassador in Paris at the age of 14, and received similar appointment of the court of Catherine the Great of Russia. So we see this is the way education was supposed to be. And I just use this as an example, but look at the elementary math problems that were during the 1860s. Now, these are given to elementary school kids. I insured 2/3 of a shop worth $3,600 and 4/5 of a house worth $6,000, paying $126. What was the rate of interest? Rate of insurance? How much money must be given to 9 $100 shares at 15% discount in exchange for 8 $100 bonds at 2% discount? Or consider also the math problems. Now, this is given in 1877, a mental math test. No pencil, no paper allowed. They had to solve these in their mind. A boat worth $864, of which 1/8 belonged to A, 1/4 belonged to B, and the rest to C, was lost. What loss did each sustain, it having been insured for $500? Or 2, a farmer, there are 60 animals, horses, cows, and sheep. For each horse, there are 3 cows. For each cow, there are 2 sheep. How many animals of each kind? Or 3, if 7 men can do a piece of work in 4 days, in what time can it be done if 3 men leave when the work is half completed? That's what we're dealing with. That's what the kids in elementary schools were being able to do in their heads back then. We're not teaching science from a biblical perspective. Geology, we're not teaching the global flood with billions. We're teaching the global flood with billions of dead things laid down by waters in layers all over the earth. Or are we allowing uniformitarianism with millions of transitional forms showing gradual increase in complexity with everything still being in some form of transition? Are we allowing this to go unchallenged? Are we teaching biology? Are we teaching an evolutionary tree? Or are we teaching a creationist forest? In other words, a creationist forest is seeing everything coming off the flood, these major kinds, and there's variation a little bit within the kind. For example, the wolf may be responsible for most of the dog kinds, or maybe all of the dog kinds. But basically, each kind was created, and there's variation within the kind. There's no transition from one kind to another. And that's basically what we're seeing. Well, there was a book that was written. It's called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. It was written by Charlotte Iserby. She was in the Reagan administration, and she somehow managed to get into the Department of Education. She didn't have the credentials, but somehow she got in there, and she noticed what was happening. And she said, this is a deliberate dumbing down of our students, our children in America. And so she took all this information, and she ended up bringing it out and making copies and storing it away anyway, she ended up sending a copy to Human Events, which was a conservative paper, and they published it. And all of a sudden, she got fired. But she had already preserved all this material, and she ended up taking this material and writing the book called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. It's an excellent book, by the way. And I knew Charlotte Iserby. In fact, she helped me write one of my dissertations. And she shows the transformation of American education has been profoundly destructive consequences by 12th grade American children, our math and science dunces by international standards. We need to see government schools not as they claim to be or as they once were, but as they are, irreformable. A survey published in the summer of 2001 by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation found that a quarter of the teenagers had no idea that the Americans fought each other during the Civil War, that there were 13 original colonies that declared their independence from England. 10% couldn't identify the first president of the United States, and 1/3 didn't know who Abraham Lincoln was. Now, this is just, unfortunately, this is what's happening. There was a guy named Alan Quist. He wrote FedEd, and it's the new federal curriculum, and it's now being enforced. And he sent me this book, actually, before it actually got published. The book shows how, by taking control of the public school curriculum, rewriting American history, calling it social studies, undermining the national sovereignty, minimizing the natural law, promoting environmentalism, requiring multiculturalism, restructuring government, and redefining daughters of the king and queen. They were given a special education. They called it a liberal education, where they were able to get information on a variety of subjects. And that's kind of the way American schools were. They were teaching a liberal education to everybody, because who was going to be the leader, the president of America? It was the people. We, the people, are ruling. And so if the people are ruling, then they need to be well educated. And that's the way it was in America. But now they're trying to educate people just for job skills. They don't want them to be educated in a broader sense. And so that's why Alan Quist wrote the book, America's Schools, The Battleground for Freedom. There was another book, it's called Abolition. Is basically, we need to get rid of public education altogether. The book contends that the public schools should be abolished. He says the government's days of dictating what ideas children are exposed to are numbered. The government school system is going to be abolished, as God never granted government the right to use force and coercion to advance thought, their humanistic thought. Christians are on notice of this, that most of them foolishly think they can reform a government school system which should not exist in the first place. It's kind of like trying to reform a sexual brothel or something. That was not God's intent. And so we're not going to do that, and we're not going to reform government school system. It's a tyrannical mechanism that commands our youth to think in anti-Christian terms, and it must be abolished. If Christians disregard this, we're in real trouble. In fact, 85% of Christian parents send their kids to these public doctrinal, humanistic indoctrination centers we call public schools. There's called Education Reformation. It's a call for parents to abandon public schools, again, out of the average of a 30-student high school class in public schools. 15 are sexually active, 23 believe that homosexuality is an acceptable alternative lifestyle, 14 don't see the great risk of heavy drinking, 12 of them have used marijuana, 9 admitted to stealing from a store in the past year, 24 admit to lying to the parents about something significant, 18 admit to cheating on a test during the last year, and even though they have done all these things, 28 out of the 30 are satisfied with their personal ethics. This is an example of the moral decline that we're seeing. In fact, John Taylor Gatto wrote a book called The Dark World of Compulsory Schooling. And what he sees, he had a picture of a diagram showing a snake, different animals, a chicken, a dog, a pigeon, a bunch of animals, and a cat and various other things. And he says, okay, I want all of you to climb that tree. See, everybody has different gifts. And when you put everybody in the same kind of system and go at the same speed, trying to teach everybody just exactly what you think they need to learn, it deadens creativity. It doesn't allow kids to use their natural gifts. It cripples imagination, discourages critical thinking. And so that's where he wrote that book. Now, the next one, I'd like to see a guy named Jerry Bergman. Jerry Bergman was probably one of the best teachers in the country. He had something to the equivalent of 4 master's degrees. Somebody had said he had the equivalent of 20 master's degrees and at least 3 or 4 earned doctorates. But anyway, he lost his job as a teacher in Ohio. And so he wrote a book called Slaughter of the Dissidents. And then by doing that, he basically interviewed other people who had the same thing happen to them. And none of the publishers would publish his book because they said, this is not happening in America. He says, we have freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Not in the academic world, you don't. In fact, I got him a copy of Ben Stein's 2008 documentary film called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And Jerry watched it with me. He bought cases of that book because he said, this is exactly what's happening in American schools. And so he was through in Slaughter of the Dissidents. He goes and interviews these people in detail, and he shows that they basically got fired, not for not teaching. They were excellent teachers, but the fact that they were Darwin doubters. They doubted some of the things in Darwin's theory of evolution, and that was enough to get him fired. And so he wrote other books. In fact, he wrote one called after Slaughter of the Dissidents. He wrote Silencing the Darwin Skeptics. When you don't have an argument, what do? You call people names, and that's what they do. They name-calling problem they used on articles about Darwin skeptics. They called them incompetent, ignoramuses, retrogressives, stupid, liars, unqualified, idiots, mentally retarded, and 40 other things. In fact, they did a study and that found that these people, they were calling intelligent design people this. Now, the intelligent design people were not telling us who God was. They were just saying that there was some force out there that was intelligent source causing things to be created. So, in other words, in order for them to call these people all of these names, they have to be atheists. We're dealing with absolute atheism. They called intelligent design 484,000 times they called them dangerous. 445,000 times they called them a threat. Stupid, ignoramus, dumb, fools, uneducated, bigots, flat earthers, jerks. And so this is basically what happens. When you don't have an argument, you just call people names, and that's what's happened. I have a map showing the Charles Darwin voyage around the world and basically stopping at the Galapagos Islands. And basically, what happened? We had people teaching. Now, I have a picture of Austin Clark. He wrote a book called The New Evolution, Zoogenesis. Now, he was a brilliant scientist. In fact, he authored several books, about 600 scientific articles, and he found that there was no evidence for cross-species mutation. In other words, one animal didn't become another. He said, after all of his studies, in 1930, he wrote the book, The New Evolution. He said, if you're going to believe in evolution, it has to start from dirt and water because these things aren't changing from one kind to another. And that was the same year that a guy named Richard Goldschmidt gave up too. And he basically had been bombarding fruit flies for 25 years at the University of Illinois at the University of California in Berkeley. And he produced a large number of mutations. He'd end up with fruit flies that had 4 wings and 6 wings, but they had no muscles attached to their wings, so they couldn't fly very well. The other wings got in the way. He wasn't able to change it into a horse fly or a house fly or a giraffe or anything else. And after 10 more years of study, he finally wrote a book that basically just destroyed the evolutionary uniformitarian model. And he showed that this basically couldn't happen. There is no gradual one kind moving to another. It was called the material basis of evolution. He literally tore apart evolutionary uniformitarianism. No evolutionist could answer him. Like them, he was a confirmed evolutionary atheist, but he was honestly facing the facts. After soundly destroying their theory, he came up with what he called the hopeful monster theory. In other words, this mother reptile, in good faith, laid a reptile egg, and I'll pop this bird. And so that's basically what Stephen Jay Gould is believing today. He calls it punctuated equilibrium. It's the same thing. It jumped from one kind to another kind. Why? Because there's no transitional forms. Now I'd like to look at the origin of the universe itself. And by their fruits you will know them. Now this is true of individuals, but it's also true of philosophies and theories. We have one of the most egregious of all evolutionary scenarios is the wonderland of evolutionary cosmophysics. Here we encounter an ever-changing kaleidoscope of quantum fluctuations of nothing into everything, cosmic inflation, multiple universes, 10-dimensional spaces, effects without causes, black holes, universes reproducing themselves, ordered systems out of chaotic explosions, hyperstrings, loops of time, and all kinds of marvels generated by higher dimensional mathematics and computer simulations. Modern astrophysicists, in fact, are currently speculating that the entire universe spontaneously evolved out of nothing. I had one professor say, "You can't tell me nothing created everything. I know too much about nothing." In this picture, the universe came into existence as a fluctuation of quantum mechanical vacuum. We asked the person who actually came up with that, and what does that mean? A quantum mechanical vacuum, a fluctuation in a quantum mechanical vacuum. He says, "I don't know." So he didn't even know what it was. Anyway, this modern physicists do not have a single picture of the way the world actually is. Instead, there's 8 ideas of quantum reality. The 8 views of quantum reality are quite different, yet all considered by leading scientists to be valid. One was that there's no deep reality. There's nothing there. If you get down to a quantum level, it doesn't exist. The second one was reality is created by observation. Somehow, by observing it, you're creating it. Reality is undivided wholeness. Everything's connected. Sounds like Hinduism. Reality consists of steadily increasing number of parallel universes. That's how they explain the creation of the universe. They just go back one and said that universe created another one, created another one. This is the world obeys a non-human kind of reasoning. In other words, they don't have a clue. The world is made out of ordinary objects. This was Einstein's theory. He believed that we couldn't see them. We just need to get better microscopes, but basically it's there. Consciousness creates reality was another one. The world is twofold, consists of potentials and actualities. Such a hypothesis leads to a view of creation in which the entire universe is an accident. As Tyrone, professor of physics at City University in New York, said in 1973, "I propose that our universe has been created spontaneously from nothing as a result of established principles in physics," but he never describes what those established principles are. Our universe is simply one of those things which happens from time to time. In other words, a tiny bit of nothing packed so tightly together that it created the entire universe. It exploded and produced all the matter in the universe. Well, first of all, nothingness can't pack itself together. There'd be nothing to push, no way to push itself into a pile. Secondly, a vacuum has no density. They're said that the nothingness got very dense, and that's why it exploded. But the total vacuum is the opposite of total density. Third, there'd be no ignition without to explode the nothingness. No fire, no match. It couldn't be a chemical fire. Couldn't be a chemical explosion. There were no chemicals. It couldn't be a nuclear explosion. There were no atoms. Fourth, there's no way to expand. How can you expand what isn't there? Even if a mechanical vacuum could somehow be pulled together by gravity, what would cause the pile of emptiness to push outward? The gravity which brought it together would keep it from exploding. Fifth, nothingness can't produce heat. The intense heat caused by the exploding nothingness is supposed to change the nothingness into protons, neutrons, and electrons. First, an empty vacuum in the extreme cold of outer space can't get hot by itself. Second, an empty void can't magically change itself into matter. Sixth, there can't be any heat without an energy source. And nuclear gaps at mass 5 and mass 8 make it impossible for hydrogen or helium to change itself into any of the heavier elements. It's called the mass 5 gap. And it's very significant because we don't know of any way to accomplish that. And here's an origin of the universe and solar system. And basically, there are 7 theories about the origin of our solar system, which would explain the origins of all the other solar systems in the universe. And the first one is called the nebular hypothesis. The second with the fission theory, capture theory, accretion theory, planetary collision theory, stellar collision theory, gas cloud theory. But the thing is, all 7 of these theories require circling gas, which contracts itself into the sun. Many say that the material from the sun made the planets and the moons, but the elemental composition of each of the planets is different from the sun and from one another. So one couldn't come from the other. In addition, the sun would have to rotate extremely fast in order to hurl off all the planets and moons, yet it rotates very slowly. Saturn has 33 known moons. None of them, or one of them, Phoebe, has an orbit almost perpendicular to Saturn's equator. This is difficult for evolutionists to explain. And the fact is that the fission theory says our sun burst and sent out planets and moons, but they would fly continually outward forever. They wouldn't start circling the sun or each other. The capture theory says our planets and moons were wandering around and were captured by our sun. But that wouldn't explain why they wouldn't crash into the sun, or they would start flying around the planets, would start flying around the sun, or moons flying around the planets. The accretion theory says that the small chunks of material gradually got together and formed our planet, and more chunks formed our moon. That doesn't have anything. That's no chunks are just floating around, and those chunks would not stick to each other anyway. The planetary collision theory says our world collided with a small planet, producing the moon, but such an impact would have totally destroyed our planet, and it wouldn't cause the moon to start circling. The stellar collision theory says two stars collided and produced our planets and moons, but they would not just pause and circle one another, one of the suns. The gas cloud theory says gas clouds were pulled in from outer space by our sun's gravity, and then they paused, formed themselves into planets and moons. That's ridiculous. The solar theories do not explain where stars, planets, and moons originated or how they arrived at their present intricate pattern. Such precision could not come about by chance. Every moon is located at a precise distance to keep it from flying into or away from its planet. How could this originate from a single explosion or collision? None of these theories fit into the laws of physics as we know them today. 99.5% of the angular rotational momentum of our solar system is concentrated in the planets, yet 99.8% of the mass is in the sun. This doesn't really make any sense. According to David Laser of Harvard, in order for the sun to originally have been part of the same mass as the planets and moons, it would have had to rotate 10 million times faster. Laser says if our sun lost so much of its momentum, why did the planets not lose theirs? So the orbits of Mercury, Pluto, asteroids, and comets each have an extreme inclination from the plane of the sun's ecliptic. The solar origin theories cannot explain this. The solar system used to be a simple place, but once more we studied it, but 30 years of planetary explanation have replaced a simple picture with far more complex image. The chemical makeup of our moon is distinctly different from that of the Earth, and that's true of all the moons. The theorists to explain this to the surprise of scientists after they studied the material the moon was made out of. In fact, one professor said the best explanation for the Earth's moon is observational error. In other words, it doesn't exist. We could look at a lot of other things, Jupiter's moons. Jupiter has one moon called Io. It's the innermost form of the Galilean moon. It has 60 active volcanoes. Now, it is shooting these plumes of ejecta from 60 to 160 miles up in the air, and it's shooting this out at 2,000 miles per hour. In other words, if this moon were old, it wouldn't have any volcanoes, let alone 60 of them. It wouldn't be able to do this, so we know that the moon is quite young, along with the rest of our solar system. It's quite young. Now, I'd like to change directions here. I'd like to go to the origin of DNA. We're looking at the universe. Now we're going to look at the minuscule stuff in DNA and protein. And so now I look at this, and looking at this, we start off with this idea, this elephant in the living room. Now, George Kaler, he was interviewed by Sam, who was a molecular biologist. Their names are changed to protect the innocent there. But George asked Sam about his work. And Sam said his team they were like scientific detectives working with DNA and tracking down the cause of disease. Here's their published conversation. George, sounds like a pretty complicated work. Sam, you can't imagine how complicated. George, try me. I'm a bit like an editor trying to find spelling mistake inside a document larger than 4 complete sets of Encyclopedia Britannica. 70 volumes, thousands and thousands of pages of small print words. George, well, with computer power, you can just use spell check. Sam, There is no spell check because we don't even know how words are supposed to be spelled. We don't even know for sure what language we're dealing with. And it's not just the spelling. We're looking for any punctuation out of place, a space out of place, a grammatical error. And we have one minor mutation, it'll cause disease. Well, how do you do this? Well, we're learning as we go along. George, how did all this information happen to get there? Sam, do you mean it happen? Did it just happen? Did it evolve? George, yes. Do you believe the information evolved? Sam, George, nobody I know in my profession truly believes it evolved. It was engineered by genius beyond genius. And such information could not have been written any other way. The paper could not write the book. Knowing what we know, it would be ridiculous to think otherwise. A bit of Neil Armstrong going to the moon thinking it's made of green cheese. He knows better. He's been there. Well, George, have you ever stated in public lecture or any public writings? No, it just evolved. What do you mean it evolved? You just told me it was created by, stop right there. To be a molecular biologist requires you to hold on to two insanities at the same time. One, it'd be insane to believe in evolution when you can see the truth for yourself. Two, it'd be insane to say you don't believe in evolution. All government work, all research papers, grants, big college lectures, everything would stop. I'd be out of a job and couldn't earn a decent living. So, in other words, we have to basically live as with this elephant in the living room. What elephant? Design. It's basically, it's like it moves around, takes up an enormous amount of space, bumps into things, knocks things over, eats a ton of hay, smells like an elephant, and yet we have to swear it isn't there. So let's look at design. The origin of DNA and protein. Proteins depend upon DNA for their formation, but DNA cannot form and therefore exist without pre-existing proteins. Sagan called this a dilemma of biological treadmill. In other words, how could nucleic acids have arisen without enzymes to make them, and how could protein have arisen without nucleic acid to direct the sequence of monomers? The peptide is a short chain of amino acids. The amino acids in a peptide are connected to one another through a sequence called peptide bonds. Typically, peptide bonds are distinguished from proteins by their shorter length, usually under 30 amino acids. Nucleotides are building blocks of nucleic acid and the substance that controls all hereditary characteristics. DNA is made from nucleotides, which have two components, a sugar deoxyribose and a phosphate groups, and a nitrogenous bases known as cytosine, thymine, adenine, and guanine. The genetic code is formed from different arrangements of these bases. A ribosome serves as a site for protein synthesis, and a eukaryote is a cell or organism that possesses a clearly defined nucleus. The eukaryote cell has a nuclear membrane that surrounds the nucleus where the chromosomes that carry the hereditary material are located. So we have basically a lot of information here. DNA cell nucleus carries a genetic code which consists of sequences of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. A prokaryote is any organism that lacks the distinct nucleus and other organelles due to the absence of an internal membrane. Bacteria are among the best known prokaryote organisms. RNA carries the code to the protein-making sites in the cell. In other words, RNA is going into the cell nucleus, taking a picture of that genetic code. It's like going into a library that has rare books. You can't go take the rare book out, but you can make a Xerox copy of it and take it out. And that's what the RNA does essentially. And to make RNA, DNA pairs its bases to those of the free nucleotides. Messenger RNA, that's mRNA, then travels to the ribosomes in the cell cytoplasm where the protein synthesis occurs. The base triplets of transfer tRNA, a pair with those of mRNA at the same time, deposit their amino acids on the growing protein chain. Finally, the synthesized protein is released to perform its task in the cell or elsewhere in the body. A single actively replicating eukaryote cell, for example, may contain as many as 10 million ribosomes. A ribosome is a complex molecular machine found within all living cells that serves as a site of biological protein synthesis, as I said. And they link amino acids together in order specified by the messenger RNA molecules. And so we have 4 chemical bases, and basically we see those. Interesting enough, even if you had the correct amino acids, no peptide bond could form without one, a mechanism such as a rough endoplasmic reticulum ribosome pushing the amino acids together in zipper fashion to overcome the physical barriers, and 2 energy molecules such as GTP, guanosine triphosphate, already attached to the amino acids to transmit the necessary energy to the bonding site to overcome the reversible action and endothermic barrier to formation. In other words, it's endothermic. In other words, it needs energy. It uses energy in order to form. Where's it going to get that energy? Well, that's what the triphosphate is for. It has to be attached to the amino acid to start off with. And so this is not happening, and it never happened. In fact, to date, no such helpers have been found by themselves nor made in any laboratory. Assuming we had these helpers, which we don't, but assuming we had, what is the probability of forming the sufficient DNA to code 124 specifically sequenced proteins of 400 amino acids each? Now, this is theoretically the simplest life form. So the number of bases or nucleotides necessary to code the proteins, that's 124 proteins of 400 amino acids each, would be the total number of amino acids in 124 proteins. That's 400 times 124, and then times 3, since you need 3 DNA bases or nucleotides for each to code one amino acid. Since we have 4 chemical bases, nucleotides, the probability of forming one DNA is 1 over 4 times 1 over 4, 148,800 times, which is 1 over 10 to the 89,280th power. But what is the probability of forming that sufficient DNA code of 124 proteins of 400 amino acids? Well, let's take 1 trillion galaxies. Now, they say that there's possibly up to 2 trillion galaxies out there. Nobody knows for sure. But each with 100 billion stars. Our Milky Way has 200 billion stars, but this makes it easy. 1 trillion galaxies with each 100 billion stars, each one with 1 million Earths surrounding each star, and every molecule in the oceans of all these Earths being a nucleotide trying to link together to form a DNA every second for 10 billion years. So we add all the exponents up. 10 to the 12th is the number of galaxies times 10 to the 11th stars per galaxy times 10 to the 6th Earths per each star times 10 to the 17th, that's seconds in 10 billion years, times 10 to the 47th, that's molecules in the oceans of each Earth, times 10 to the 5th, that's the approximate number of nucleotides in one DNA, times 10 to the 50th, that's the viable number of DNAs ever in existence. So you take 10 to the 148th and you divide that number by what we just came up with, 1 over 10 to the 89,280th power, which is 1 over 10 to the 89,132nd power. We just subtract the exponents there. That means that 10 to the 89,132 molecules must form on average to provide the one chance of forming the specific DNA sequence necessary to code the 124 proteins. 10 to the 89,130th power DNA molecules would weigh 10 to the 89,089 times more than the Earth and would be sufficient to fill the universe many times over. It's estimated the amount of DNA molecules necessary to code 100 billion people could be contained in half an aspirin tablet. So how improbable is this? It should be noted that you can only cram 10 to the 130th power electrons in the known universe. So a living entity of 124 proteins of 400 amino acids is theoretically the simplest possible living organism, but in reality, even a simple bacterium, Escherichia coli, the common intestinal habitat of man and animal, contains 3 million DNA base pairs. Thus, it could manufacture 2,500 proteins. That's 20 times the number of proteins, or 400 amino acids each. So basically, you've got these 20 amino acids basically that form life. Basically, they're D and L. D means right. It comes from the Latin word dexter. L is left. So you've got left and right, but they all have to be left-handed because they collapse in on each other. So one right-handed amino acid would poison the entire system. So the probability of getting all left-handed amino acids is 1 over 10 to the 14,136 power. So since there's 20 amino acids and the probability of each, that's where we get that number. And the probability of them all being L amino acids, the probability is 1 over 10 to the to 64,390th power times 1 over 10 to the 14,048th power, which is 1 over 10 to the 78,436 power. If both sufficient DNA to code the 124 proteins and sufficient protein, that's 124, to house and catalyze the DNA, independently evolved the subsequently associated together to form the first living entity, their individual probabilities must be multiplied. So we add the exponents there, and we get 1 over 10 to the 167,568 power, assuming 1 million Earths around every star in the universe, each having all of its oceans full of nucleotides linking to form DNAs every second for 10 billion years. But not only do you need that, you need a translation package at the beginning. The amount of information in the genetic code is so vast it would be impossible to have put it all together by chance. In addition, there must be a means of translating it so the tissues can use the code. You need a messenger RNA. A special messenger RNA molecules are needed, and without them, the DNA is useless. Each amino acid must be activated by a specific enzyme designed for that amino acid, and each amino acid is then combined with another type of RNA known as this sRNA or soluble RNA. And there's an electrical polarity that's also key. There's positive and negative impulses that needs to be tracked down. Then you have a mediating substance called tRNA. The code in both the plants and animals is DNA, but DNA is chemically different from the amino acids, which gives orders. It gives orders to make. So this code must decide into which of the 20 essential proteins the amino acids will then form themselves into. There's an immediate substance between DNA and the amino acids and proteins. That mediating substance is called tRNA. And now the complexity gets worse because each of the 20 essential proteins requires a different intermediate tRNA. Then you need a biological compiler. That's mRNA. The biological compiler that accomplishes these codes is called mRNA. It changes DNA code language into a different language that the cells can understand, so they can set about producing the right amino acid and proteins. Without these many mRNA molecules, the entire code and what it should produce would break down. Then you need DNA indexing. Information that is inaccessible is useless, even though it might be very complete. With a non-DNA chemicals, which work as indexes to specifically locate the needed information, the index triggers the production of materials by the DNA. The presence of these materials in turn triggers the indexing to additional productions. Then you have cell switching. What's most important? What should be done next? Computers function by following sequential set of instructions. First do this, then do that. And they're told in response, they then switch from one subroutine to another. But how does the cell switch its DNA from one process to another? Nobody knows. A lot of this is in a book called Creation and Evolution Controversy by R.W. Weissong. Jess Wade, a physicist at Imperial College London, admitted that while about 99.9% of atom was empty space, it was cheating a bit to describe this as the main constituent of humans, because this is true of all matter. But if it weren't for this space, we'd be tiny. Dr. Wade said in physics.org that if the space were removed, the entire human population would take up the same space as a sugar cube. An example of something like this is actually what happens with a neutron star when it's so dense that a teaspoon of neutron star would weigh 1 billion tons. So we see the complexity of hemoglobin. A friend of mine, Dave Kopage, he wrote a book on probabilities, and he argues that the time necessary to form one protein is commensurate with the time necessary for an amoeba crawling at the breathtaking speed of 1 inch per year to move the entire mass of universe of 10 to the 64th galaxies the size of ours, one atom at a time across the string stretched the 30 billion light year diameter of the known universe. David Kopage, a brilliant guy, and basically was in charge of a lot of things that were happening. He actually was terminated because he gave a friend, one of his associates who wanted it, a copy of one of the videos. It was called Our Privileged Planet. And it was written by people who didn't even talk about God. They just said that our Earth is very strange. It's very unique in the universe. And it kind of shows that there must be some creator out there. But just because he gave something to someone who wanted it, somebody objected and he was fired. And basically, not only was he fired, but he He was, for 14 years, he was an information technology specialist, a system administrator for the Cassini mission to Saturn, operated by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California under contract with NASA. Cassini was regarded by many as the most ambitious interplanetary exploration mission ever launched, and Kopech served as the mission's team lead, the system administrator, for 9 years. In that position, he and his team managed the computers that sent and received messages from the Cassini spacecraft. Kopech was a valued JLP employee, received the highest recommendations from his managers, but because of this, and this is what we're dealing with in this world today, you cannot even talk about be a Darwin doubter and keep your job. Here's a picture of the biochemistry of a single human cell. And this is despite the virtually impossible odds that proteins arose by chance processes. There's not the remotest reason to believe they could ever form a membrane-encased, self-reproducing, self-repairing, metabolizing living cell. This is a jump in complexity that nobody's ever even begun to try to explain. And a guy named Michael Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And in that book, he explained the ridiculous possibility of forming a cell just from proteins. As a result, his career was over. We also have reductionism and biochemistry bias. Reductionism shows that you can take apart a typewriter, for example, and understand how the thing works, and you can take away certain things, but you need a light microscope. You can see the relationship between chromosomes and cellular division, and electron microscopy allows us to visualize genes and the DNA molecules within the chromosomes. Chemical analysis, X-ray diffraction studies have revealed specific structure of DNA, base pairing, and the roles of DNA, RNA, mRNA, tRNA, and various enzymes in genetics and heredity. However, reductionism is only useful for explaining the operation of the machine, not its origin. As a book can't be accounted for by knowledge of the cellulose and painting and constituent atoms, and a painting can't be accounted for by its canvas and can't be so life can't be accounted for by enumeration of nucleotides and chemical laws governing their interactions. So there is biochemical bias, various other things, but biochemical, in fact, bias not relieves evolutionist dilemma, because if DNA letters show preferences in DNA chain, then amino acids would all be the same. Then all the DNA would be the same. So life is very diverse. So basically, we have all of this, and we look at our human eye. Our eye has 10 million photoreceptor cells. Each one has the capacity to perform the equivalent of 500 nonlinear simultaneous differential equations 100 times a millisecond. So when you consider there's 10 million of them interacting with each other in complex ways, it would take a Cray supercomputer over 100 years to simulate what takes place in the back of your eye many times every second. Your eardrum can sense 1/10 the diameter of a hydrogen atom motion, yet it has red corpuscles that are 100,000 times that diameter rushing through it, but it doesn't hear those. And it sends that signal to the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And it goes up against another membrane attached to the cochlea. The cochlea has 3 chambers. The inner chamber, called the cochlear duct, has the organ of Corti and the tectoral membrane, and between those two are thousands of tiny hair cells. Each one has a trapdoor and a spring cell attached to it that opens and closes up to 20,000 times a second to let a single charged sodium ion, which we interpret as sound. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. So with that, I will conclude. Basically, we know that it couldn't happen. Life could not happen naturally, so it had to happen supernaturally. The only explanation is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we look throughout the gamut of literature available to us as humans, and I find only one book that passes the test required to be the Word of God, and we'll discuss that next time. Thank you for listening.